All right, so thank you very much, firstly, to MS Auckland for the opportunity and invitation to come and talk at this webinar tonight. As Luminita said, largely what I'm going to be talking about tonight is highlights from the recent MS Milan 2023, which was the joint ECTRIMS conference. So this is the largest MS research conference in the world that happens every year, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, understanding that some of the people joining tonight may not have a great understanding of who I am or who MS Translate is. I just want to give a really brief introduction to that to begin with. Then I'll move into talking about the research highlights. Very much for me tonight, my priority is to answer as many of your questions as possible. So please do, throughout the presentation, drop in questions as you have them. All questions are welcomed. I'm happy to try and answer anything that you have to ask. I've sort of suggested that if questions come through based on what I'm talking about at the time, I'm more than happy to be interrupted and handle them as we go through. But there'll also be probably plenty of time at the end to do some Q&A then. Happy to answer questions about research that I'm discussing from ECTRIMS or broader research questions, especially at the end if you have questions about things that I haven't discussed. So to sort of launch into the presentation, as already mentioned, my name is Brett Drummond and I'm the co-founder of MS Translate. So MS Translate really was largely formed by myself and my brother Eric. And so my background is in multiple sclerosis research. I did multiple sclerosis research for many years, largely looking into what are the causes of the autoimmune response in MS. So basically what happens to make the immune system start to attack the nerves, to start to attack itself. During the time when I was doing research, I also got some experience doing science communication work, working for a government agency that was based in the same building as my research lab, where we were talking to the general public about emerging technologies. And in 2012, I got to a point where I needed to get away from the research bench for a while, but at that point, I'd been working on MS for a number of years, and so I was really committed to wanting to keep giving to the MS community. And so I started having conversations with my brother Eric about how we might be able to work together. And his background was in web and social media. And so essentially the idea for MS Translate came about, and we actually established it in late 2012. So we're now just celebrated our 11th birthday, which is quite crazy for me to sort of comprehend that we've been going for that long. But really what MS Translate seeks to do is to provide updates to people living with MS, but also the broader MS community about up-to-date multiple sclerosis research, but in a way that's both easy to understand and accurate. And it's not often that those two things necessarily come together. We know that when research tends to be talked about in mainstream media, while it might be easy to understand, often the people writing it haven't gone directly to the research publications or don't necessarily have that research background. And so sometimes the accuracy is lost. Or if it's published accurately, it's often published in scientific journals. It's not easily accessible for the general public, and the language used there isn't really appropriate for someone that doesn't have a research background either. So the fact that I have both the background in MS research as well as the science communication means that we're able to bring those two together. I'm happy to answer lots of questions about MS Translate if you have them. I did talk about it quite a bit on a presentation I did last year, which you can find as well, and I sort of go more into the background of why it's really important that we have resources like this, and give some examples of MS research that we've seen publicized in mainstream media before that was really inaccurately reported. But I wasn't going to go into that tonight because I really want to give as much time as possible to answer your questions and to get into the research from the conference. But if you do, if you weren't aware of MS Translate before now, and you do find that you want to follow us to keep up to date with what we're doing, we have our website, which is easily found just by Googling MS Translate. Always try and make sure that you remember it's capital MS, lowercase translate, all one word, makes the searches easier. But we have our website, which is where all of our research summary articles go and all of the material that we produce directly ourselves. But then you can also find us across basically all social media channels, Facebook, X, which I still need to get my head around as the worst rebrand possibly in the history of any companies, YouTube, which is where all of our video content goes, Instagram, and LinkedIn, although LinkedIn is more to connect with other healthcare professionals and things like that. So all of those platforms contain lots of different content. Sometimes we're sharing content generated by others and providing our own comments on them and engaging in conversation under those posts. Some platforms are purely for things that we're creating ourselves. In terms of YouTube, for example, if you were to go to YouTube and look at our most recent videos, we did daily summaries from Milan, from the conference, where we talked about highlights that we'd seen that day. And that was in combination with myself and also Dr. Travis Stiles, who is from Novaron Bioscience. And I'm going to talk a little bit about their work later as well, but he's been a long-term member of the team as well, and he provides guidance and information for us, particularly around conference time. And also Dr. Joanna Cobban, who's the most recent member of the team, who's another science communicator and former researcher. So you can watch those videos as well, where we go into some of the things that I'm going to be talking about tonight and some other things as well. So MS Milan 2023, you can see here a photo of this. Was my little bit of time pre-conference getting to wander around the center of Milan and looking at the Duomo, which I also made my virtual background here. I'm back in Melbourne now, based in Melbourne, Australia. I'm back in Melbourne now, but the virtual background gets me back into the mood of being at Milan, ready for conference time. So just to give you a bit of a feel for what these conferences are like before we launch into the topics. So this conference happens every year. Every 3 years, the conference is a joint conference between ECTRIMS and ACTRIMS. So ECTRIMS is the European committee, ACTRIMS is the American committee. And then every 6 years, the big conference is in America, but generally every year it's in Europe. And this year was in Milan. And on average, there's around 9,000 people who attend this meeting. And so they're a mixture of researchers, neurologists, MS nurses, industry members, media. And so it's a really large gathering of pretty much everyone who is interested and involved in hearing about the latest in multiple sclerosis research. The conference runs across 3 days. So Wednesday, always Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And as of last year and this year again, the fourth day, the Saturday, is now a day for people living with MS, where there's a couple of hours where people from the conference talk about some of the main themes from that. During the 3 days of the conference runs from about 8 a.m. in the morning through till about 5 or 6 o'clock at night. And there's multiple sessions that run throughout. And in each session block, there are 9 different sessions running at the same time. So if you think there's 3 or 4 sessions throughout the day, 9 things in each session, that's about 36 different topics that we're talking about a day. Times that by 3, that's 108 topics. I shouldn't have given myself difficult maths to do, but that's about 108 topics that are going on. Obviously, you can only go to one at a time, so we're a little restricted in terms of being able to see everything, although we do get access to it after the conference, and I'm in the process of now going through and looking at some of the other things. So the topics that I'm talking about tonight are the sessions that I was able to sit in and hear. There was a lot more going on, and I'm happy to try and answer questions about those as well. So I've tried to break it down into topics that I think were either really interesting and groundbreaking topics from the conference itself, as well as topics that I know are of interest to the MS community through, feedback that we get at MS Translate. So the first one the first topic and real piece of information that I want to talk about is to do with genetics and progression. So genetics is a topic that we know is of interest to people living with MS, and it's been something that we've talked about for a really long time in multiple sclerosis research. So we have known for a really long time that MS has a genetic component to it, but it's not a genetic disease. So it's not a classical genetic disease where it gets passed on, and if you have a certain variant of a gene, you will develop multiple sclerosis. It doesn't work like that. But we do know that if you have certain variants of genes, that can increase your risk of developing multiple sclerosis. And as of very recently, there was about 237 genetic variants that have been identified that contribute to MS susceptibility. Now, the majority of those genes actually have a really small effect. None of these genes have a huge effect in terms of increasing your risk. There are a couple particularly associated with the immune system that have a large-ish increase in risk, but we're talking, not huge in terms of the broad scheme of things, but slightly larger than the others. But we also know that these are additive. So the more of these gene variants that you have, they add together to increase your risk. But up until earlier this year, all of these genetic variants that had been identified were purely to do with the risk of developing MS. We didn't have anything around what happens beyond that point in terms of genetics. But in June this year, a paper was published in Nature where they have identified a genetic variant that is linked to the severity or progression of MS. So this is the first time that we'd ever identified a variant of a gene that seems to, if you have that specific variant of that specific gene, you're at a risk of having accelerated disability progression. Now, just as a bit of a background on genetics, for all of our genes, we have 2 copies of each gene. And the way that this gene variant works, if you have both copies with the variant that's linked to severity, your risk is even higher of having higher disability progression. And so this was a really huge finding, because this now opens up some really interesting avenues. And one of the big things for me sitting in sessions at the conference is that this paper was being talked about in almost every topic that I was in, and in almost every presentation they were showing figures from this paper. So this is a really big finding, because obviously while the onset of disease is of interest to us, and trying to understand that process is of interest, once a person has developed multiple sclerosis, those genes aren't necessarily that helpful to us. But this new one that's been identified, which is linked to progression, may tell us more about what's happening. And if we understand more about what's happening, that may enable us to create more targeted therapies. But also it opens up the possibility of being able to give a better prognosis. So we're certainly not at the point yet, and this is still quite early in terms of this finding. But we could think forward to think that there may be a future where we can use this genetic variant and potentially others that are identified to be able to screen at a time of diagnosis and identify whether someone is at risk of having aggressive disease progression. So that's something that I think is really interesting, and something that we'll be looking at more in the future. So that was one big finding that I think was really relevant and came. So the other I think big thing over the past 12 months, and I was talking about this a lot last year, still was quite a hot topic at this year's meeting was Epstein-Barr virus. So Epstein-Barr virus is the virus that causes glandular fever. Importantly, what's really important to understand about this is that not everyone who is exposed to this virus develops glandular fever. So you certainly can have been exposed to this virus and never know it, and most people are. But so I just want to walk through this story quickly. You may have heard this before, but I just want to walk through it quickly because it was still quite a big topic, and there is actually some updates on this that are very fresh at the moment that I wanted to share here, which I haven't even shared through MS Translate yet. But so just to walk through, we've been talking about EBV in MS research for many, many years. I mean, when I started in MS research 18 years ago, it was already something that we were talking about hugely at that point. But really, what we knew at that time was that it seemed to be that people living with MS may have had a slightly higher risk of being infected with EBV. So it was, around 95% of people living with MS had been exposed to EBV, and it was about 90% of the general population. So it was just really high in both. And so at that time, it was quite hard to make any conclusions from that. Yes, it was slightly higher in people living with MS, but it just seemed like it was just a really common virus that people are exposed to. Now, that's changed over the past couple of years because there's been a couple of really groundbreaking studies that have found more conclusive evidence around this. I won't go into huge details on this now in the interest of time, but if you want to know more about those studies, ask, and I'm happy to go through them during the question time. But essentially, with some new technologies and some really large cohorts of people and some interesting cohorts of people, including one study that used people in the US military, they were able to show that 100% of people living with MS were exposed to the virus, and that there was evidence to suggest that the disease process in MS didn't start until after exposure to the virus. So they were able to get some timing in there as well. Now, this has been of interest both in terms of, is this then necessary for MS to develop? And there is a current thinking, now it's not everyone necessarily agrees on it, but there is quite a few people in the MS research space who would say that EBV seems to be the leading cause of MS. Now, it's not the cause of MS, and that's really important in terms of how we talk about it, because obviously lots of people get exposed to EBV and never develop MS. So there must be interactions with other genetic factors, other environmental factors. But it's the leading cause of MS, and so we're interested in terms of the onset of MS. But there's also been some evidence to suggest that it may be playing a role in terms of progression of MS as well. And so there's been trials underway in America and in Australia looking at whether targeting EBV could be a new treatment avenue for people living with MS. And there's some suggestions at the moment, unfortunately, that are sort of coming out that we're still looking into a little bit, but there's some sort of reports coming out at the moment that have suggested that trial's not been successful and not meeting its endpoints, and it looks like it may stop. So it was obviously something there was a lot of excitement about. We need to really delve a little bit more into what that data is showing at the moment, but yeah, there's been some releases suggesting that they're not meeting or that the results aren't being as positive as they'd hoped, and so that trial may be being stopped. But in terms of disease onset and thinking to the future, if what a lot of the current thinking is true, in that EBV, infection with EBV is necessary for MS to develop, then potentially we have an avenue where MS could be prevented in the future. And so this would be through the development of an EBV vaccine. And so there are currently trials underway for an EBV vaccine, an mRNA vaccine against the virus. Moderna is one that are doing one. It's in very, very early stages at the moment. And I do think we need to be really careful about how we talk about this. While theoretically, if we think that the virus is necessary for MS to develop, and if we can prevent someone being infected with the virus, yes, it would make sense that we could prevent. There's still a lot of questions that we need to answer around how that would work in terms of what's the timing of when that vaccine is needed. You know, are we going to need boosters for that? Is it going to be sufficient to prevent it, or, you know, just fighting it off quickly? Is that going to do the trick, or will we still will any sort of exposure be enough to get MS to develop? There's still a lot to think about, but this is really the first time that we've been able to think about an avenue to potentially prevent MS. So it is exciting. One of the other topics that I want to talk about that I find personally really interesting, and I think some of the data around this is fascinating, is the MS prodrome. So this is a concept that I think 5 years ago we weren't talking about at all. It's really been something that's come around over the past couple of years and driven a lot by Professor Helen Tremlett, who's based at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And essentially this concept of a prodrome is things or symptoms or things that we can measure or observe before the onset of disease. So essentially the question that's being asked around this MS prodrome is, are things happening before the onset of MS that we can detect? And I think one of the important things to say at this time is that there are different ways that we think about the onset of MS. So some studies will use the time of diagnosis as that start point. And so obviously that's the time when a person's actually been told by their neurologist, you know, you have multiple sclerosis. But we also sometimes talk about the onset of MS, and studies will use the onset. And that's from when a person recalls their first symptom that's related to MS, the first MS specific symptom. And so what we're talking about here generally is talking about the onset. So it's not just diagnosis, where a lot of people will say, well, yeah, I kind of had some feelings of it beforehand. That might be the onset. You know, I had tingling in my hand, or, you know, my eyesight started to go for 6 months before, you know, I went and saw a doctor. This is even before that. So I'm just going to show an image that they've used before. Now, I'm going to try and walk through, and hopefully everyone can see the cursor on my screen as I do this. A lot of this we can sort of ignore, but I just want to talk through what we're thinking about here and what we're looking at. So here at the end of this spectrum, this is MS symptom onset. So this is, you know, that first experience that you had where you linked it back to, this is the time when I probably started to have MS. So eyesight went blurry, lost color vision, had tingling, whatever it is. This is this time at the end here. And this is the point, this is the part that we're talking about here. This is the prodromal phase, the MS prodrome. And so what the thinking is here is that actually the disease is starting much earlier. And so the disease is starting here. There's all of these things happening in between, and this is the time when the MS symptoms start. But so what they've been able to show in these studies during this prodrome is that there is a lot of things that happen in people living with MS that are different to the general population well before this MS symptom onset. So they've been able to show people who go on to be diagnosed with MS will have increased hospitalizations, increased visits to psychiatrists, increased pain, increased headaches, increased migraines, increased rates of depression and anxiety. You know, lots and lots of things in there that they're pulling out in this window. And often we're talking about a window of sort of 5 years before MS symptom onset, where a lot of these things are being identified. A lot of the studies have looked into that 5-year window. But there's been some really interesting studies as well that have looked at people with primary progressive MS. And again, looking at this time before, they can actually see up to 20 to 30 years before onset that those individuals who will go on to develop primary progressive MS already start to have decrease or problems with cognition. So these cognitive issues are happening well before the onset of MS, and they've been able to show that. So this prodromal phase, you know, could have a time from 5 years out to maybe even longer in some cases. So it's a really interesting aspect of MS research at the moment, and trying to understand what's happening in this window is really important. And one of the reasons why it's really important is because of the next topic that I want to talk about, which is in terms of treatment approaches. So in terms of treatment approaches, there has been a debate for a while around these two sort of methods of providing treatments. Escalation, which is basically starting a person on a mild therapy, essentially one of the lower efficacy therapies, less powerful, but come with less side effects. And then as they fail those treatments and that they fail to control the disease, starting to, escalate, as the term suggests, to more and more powerful therapies. Versus the induction approach, which is basically starting a person on a highly effective therapy as early as possible. And so that's been a debate for a while. I would say that based on this year's meeting, that debate is over, and now there is almost, a really large consensus that the induction approach is a much better way of going about things. And so that's getting people onto effective therapies as early as possible. And so, pardon me, there have been a really big push for this. And so this was a publication a little while ago, a couple of years ago, Time Matters in Multiple Sclerosis. And the phrase time is brain, which is something that had been used in stroke research for a really long time, is now something that we also talk about in MS. And so in this publication, one of the figures that they put in is this. Now, this is really just an illustration, but what this is showing is here we've got disease onset or diagnosis here and different approaches to what happens at that time. So if someone has no treatment, you can see that across time, their disability progression or the disability accrual will be quite high. If we get in with an effective therapy later, so there's this window from diagnosis before we get onto an effective therapy, you can see that they're in this mid-range of disability accrual. Whereas if we get them onto highly effective therapies at the start, you can see that they're much lower here. So there's this big spectrum of outcomes. But in general now, there's a lot of data to support that the earlier we can get someone onto a highly effective therapy, the better their long-term outcomes. So,
Brett, we have a question about this prodromal phase.
Yeah.
And the question is, how is the prodromal phase measured and how is it recognized by physicians?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I would say that it's not. It's not recognized at the moment. And I think part of what the push is going to have to be is starting to make this better understood by the broader community. Now, I think it's important to recognize at this point, this is still at a research stage. So this has been through observational studies where they've looked retrospectively. So this has obviously been using medical records that have been available and then going back through the medical records of people after they've been diagnosed with MS, compared those to the medical records of healthy controls of people without MS and seen, before that time, what's been different. And so they've been able to identify this. This hasn't, as far as I'm aware, been done prospectively yet. So following people in advance and seeing, can we predict the likelihood of someone going on to develop MS based on, the appearance of doing all of these sorts of things. Now, that would be the hope. And so in terms of measuring the prodrome, I guess it's putting together these parts of the jigsaw and being able to go, well, the fact that you're having quite a few headaches and migraines, as well as all of this combination of symptoms that are coming together, this is what we are putting together as the MS prodrome. And so, can we start to think that this is a person who may be at risk of developing MS? That's the idea behind how it would work, but we're not at that point yet. But yeah, I mean, the question is a great one, because that's where we would like to go with it, is to be able to identify people as early as possible at being at risk of developing multiple sclerosis, so they can be monitored essentially, so that at the earliest stages, we can intervene. And so that's why it ties in nicely to this, where we can see that, if we can intervene early, and this is a diagnosis, There has been some talk of, some therapies even coming in pre-diagnosis. So this is at MS. There's a step before that where it's clinically isolated syndrome or radiologically isolated syndrome. That's where there's only one lesion as opposed to multiples. And there's some suggestion that MS therapies at that point can be really beneficial as well. So the idea here is, can the prodrome open up a really extended window beforehand where we may be able to get in? And can we bring, this green part down even lower in terms of disability accrual if we can get in earlier and earlier and earlier? But yeah, very good question. So the next topic going on from that, and I always like to talk about lifestyle modifications at the same time as I talk about treatments, because in a way I think they go hand in hand, because they're both around what people can do to try and take control of their MS. So treatments are obviously a pharmacological way of doing that, but we also know that people living with MS definitely want a way of being able to do that on a daily basis for themselves. And so there have been a number of different lifestyle modifications that have been looked into for this. Diet and exercise are probably the two main ones. Meditation is another one that comes in there. Smoking is another big one. And really what I would say, although there's been a lot of talk around this over a number of years now, over the last 5 years, what I would say the consensus is, or the thought is at the moment of the MS research community, is basically that just living a healthy lifestyle is the best approach to this. So there's no conclusive evidence to suggest that one particular MS diet is better than any others. Certainly a healthy diet versus an unhealthy diet gives better outcomes, both in terms of MS symptoms and MS disability progression, but also in terms of comorbidities. We know that people living with MS are at a greater risk of a number of comorbidities, including cardiovascular disease. And so eating healthily, lots of fruits and vegetables, these things are going to be really important for that as well. But there's no data yet to suggest that a particular diet is better than any others. There's been some recent studies showing the Mediterranean diet may have some benefits, but generally what everyone's suggesting at the moment as a starting point for people living with MS in general is a healthy diet is the best way to go. And certainly incorporating exercise is also really important. What I would say the shift, and I think I said this 12 months ago as well, but the shift in talking about exercise, similarly to how we talk about treatments, and that's my other reason for wanting to put it here, is the earlier we can implement exercise as part of a management program for people living with MS, the better the outcomes. Some of the talk 12 months ago was largely that exercise has often been used to try and recover function after it's been lost. So if a person starts to have issues with spasticity or starts to lose mobility, that's when exercise would be implemented to try and, can we recover some of that? Whereas now, again, I said this 12 months ago, but prehabilitation versus rehabilitation is how it's being talked about. So across all of these, I think there is this understanding now of the earlier we can get in and implement these really positive habits, the better it's going to be. The one other lifestyle modification that I will talk about that again was talked about a lot at the conference, it's been talked about now for a number of years, is smoking. We know that smoking increases the risk of developing MS, but it also worsens progression. There is really strong evidence now showing that quitting smoking at any time has benefits for a person living with MS. But there was new information shared at the conference in terms of how smoking also starts to impact on genetics of people living with MS and can have impacts there. So we're building more and more on the evidence around how bad smoking is for multiple sclerosis. But yeah, that's a really strong one in terms of changes that a person can make. Quitting smoking certainly is one of those. So the next one that I want to talk about that flows through here as well is PIRA. So this is a term that you may or may not have heard about before. It's quite a new term in terms of multiple sclerosis, but it was the big theme of the conference. Sometimes PIRA is also called smoldering MS. You might have heard that. But PIRA basically stands for progression independent of relapse activities. And so what that means is that this is how traditionally we thought about multiple sclerosis. Now, again, don't worry too much about what's going on in this. I'll walk through what's going on. But really at an early stage, so when people had relapsing or remitting MS, we thought that this was solely driven by inflammation. So there was inflammation that was causing these periods of attacks or relapses, and then we would have these periods of remission, and then an attack, and then remission, attack, remission, and so on and so forth. And this was all about inflammation. And so all of the existing therapies that we have are really about targeting that inflammation. And then what we thought shifted is that we went from this period of inflammation to more a period of neurodegeneration. And so that's when we stopped having these attacks, and it was more just constant progression. And so that's when we would say a person had either shifted into secondary progressive MS, or for people diagnosed with primary progressive MS, that's where they would be from the start. And so, you know, we thought about that in terms of how the disease happened. Now, what we know is that that's not really the case. Those two things are happening, but they're both happening all of the time. And so this is a very complicated image, and you don't need to worry too much, but I'm just going to again try and walk through. Here we can see these little steps. That's the inflammation that we saw before. So this is still definitely going on. There's relapses and remissions occur in people with relapsing remitting MS. And we know that even once a person goes to secondary progressive, and in some people with primary progressive, that they can still have this inflammatory activity or relapses happening. And that's why we know that some of the existing treatments can still benefit people living with MS, even if they've gone to that progressive stage, if they still have inflammation that can be targeted. But what you can see here through this little bit is that neurodegeneration that we thought didn't happen until progression is actually happening in the background from the very start of the disease. And so now there's a lot of work on trying to understand how we can target that neurodegenerative component, because that's causing disability accrual even when this inflammation activity is not happening. So there's this degeneration going on in the background. So progression, disease progression, even without relapse activities. And so that's a really new target that people are trying to look into and target. So I've got my...
Sorry, interrupt for a second.
Right.
It's got a message from one of the people attending the webinar saying that, can you repeat the section about PIRA, progression independent relapse activities?
Yep.
And as it's a really important information.
Yeah. So,
thank you so much.
So really if I go back to this bit, this was our traditional view. So we had two different aspects of disease. Early on, all we were interested in was inflammation, and that was the relapsing remitting part. And then we had inflammation, and we could target inflammation. And eventually we would get to a point where that stopped being what was happening, and then we would have neurodegeneration. And we don't really have any therapies in MS that target neurodegeneration. And so that's often why we would find that we don't have any therapies for people once they go to secondary progressive, or for people with primary progressive MS, because it's a different disease mechanism. Different things are driving the disease process. But what's happening with PIRA, and what we're understanding, is that this process that we didn't think happened until later is actually happening from the very beginning. So this image is quite a confusing way of seeing it. But here, if you look at these steps, this is the inflammation part that we were talking about. But the shadow in the background is that neurodegeneration. And so while, yes, it definitely becomes more prominent later in disease, like we thought about, it's also happening at the very earliest stages of disease. And so what that means is that we need to find ways of being able to target that, because even if we have with some of these new therapies, if we have people where they're not having relapses as often because we're targeting that inflammation, this neurodegeneration is still going on in the background. And so that's why they've been able to see that some people, will have disease progression, even though they're not having relapses. And we always sort of thought that it was the relapses that were the driver of that. But we can see that there's this other process going on in the background. Hopefully that explains it a little bit better.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So my last couple, and then I'll leave plenty of time for questions. So remyelination, there wasn't a huge amount discussed at the conference, but I want to touch on it because I know it's really the next big thing in MS. Again, if you've heard me talk before, I might have showed this slide before, but one of the things that we know is a problem in terms of myelin repair in MS is the aging of cells. So we know that myelin repair can happen in everyone. If you get a concussion, you'll sometimes get some damage to myelin that just gets repaired, but we know that repair process gets blocked in MS. We know early in disease, people with MS can repair some of that damage, but that gets worse over time. And one of the things that people think that's related to is the aging of these cells. So these are oligodendrocytes. You don't need to worry too much, but they're cells that are involved in making the myelin that surrounds your nerves that gets damaged in MS. Young cells are great at doing it. Older cells aren't good at doing it. And so one of the therapy approaches that's being looked at the moment through the University of Cambridge is looking at targeting that and seeing if we can reduce the aging process of those cells. And one of the best ways to do that and slow down the aging process of cells is intermittent fasting. They did some animal studies using intermittent fasting where they found that the animals that did that were better at repairing their myelin. Pharmacologically, metformin is a drug that mimics the fasting process, and they saw in those animal studies as well the same thing. And so there's currently a clinical trial underway at the University of Cambridge looking at metformin in combination with another treatment, clemastine, that's also shown some potential as a myelin repair agent. I had some meetings at the University of Cambridge after the conference, got some updates on that, and we'll be looking at sharing some of that through MS Translate in the near future. I think the big thing in terms of remyelination, just as a general note, is that there is lots of things being looked at around the world and lots of different ways of approaching this. I talked before about Travis Stiles and his work with MS Translate. So his company, Novaron Bioscience, are currently doing all of their preclinical work, looking at a remyelination therapy in Hobart, with the idea that if that progresses through to clinical trials, early stage clinical trials will likely happen in this part of the world. So that's exciting as well. The last thing I want to say on this is that when I talk to people in the field about remyelination, there is no hesitation from them. I ask them the question, do you think we will get a remyelination therapy? And there is no hesitation from them, and they just say yes, definitely. So, which is not common for scientists to answer questions like that. So that gives me a lot of hope that we will see some of these progress through and become therapies for people living with MS, which I think is really important. None of the therapies that we have at the moment repair damage. They just try and stop new damage from occurring. But if we can have that in combination with some therapies that can repair existing damage, that becomes a bit of a game changer for people living with MS. So that's sort of the last research thing that I want to talk about. I just wanted to give this a little bit of a plug because I did mention that we did daily highlights through MS Translate. We also do daily highlights through the ECTRIMS podcast. So this is the official conference podcast. I am the host of that podcast. You can see me here with Professor Stephen Hauser, who I interviewed on day one. He gave the keynote opening lecture of the conference. A very weird experience for me, as when I was back doing honours in 2006, I was reading his papers, so that was quite a weird experience. But all of these episodes are freely available, so if you want to listen to any of the highlights around that from the conference or any other topics, that's also a really interesting resource to go to. Some of those episodes are a little bit more technical, but some of them definitely will be of interest to you as well. So you can find the ECTRIMS podcast on all main podcasting platforms. So that is where I will finish presentation, but happy to answer as many questions as you have. There's a lot happening happening in the world of MS research to be excited about, there's my email address as well. So if you think afterwards that you have questions, you can certainly drop them there, or follow MS Translate on all of those social media channels, and you can drop questions under our post or send us messages, private messages through those channels as well. But happy to answer any questions about any of the research that I've talked about during this presentation, or any other research that you've heard about that you're interested in asking questions about. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Brett. We have an unanswered question.
Mm-hmm.
It was somewhere in the beginning of your presentation about the gene responsible for the progression of MS.
Yep.
And someone would like more information about this gene, if you can.
So we don't know too much about it at the moment.
No. Okay.
So the interesting thing, I may have seen that question somewhere, asking for the name. The name is meaningless. It's RN and then a whole string of numbers for the gene variant. Scientists are really inventive when it comes to naming things. What's interesting about the gene, so there was one gene that seemed to really strongly associate with progression. There were some others that seemed to have a weaker effect. But what was interesting when they looked through all of this is they were wondering whether or not these were genes that were also associated with susceptibility. And so these were just general MS genes. And so maybe actually it wasn't progression specific. But what they found was that they were two very separate populations. So all of those genes, those 230 genes that I talked about that increased risk of susceptibility, almost all of those are linked to the immune system in some way, whereas there was no overlap between those and the progression genes that they identified. And the progression genes that they identified seem to be more closely associated with proteins associated with the central nervous system. The gene variant is some sort of zinc finger protein, but we don't know exactly what role it's playing at the moment.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we've got some other questions. One is in regards to smoking. When you talked about lifestyle changes, what impacts on MS, this nicotine, the chemicals, the smoke? What does it
do? Yeah, I mean, a good question. So disease mechanism wise, we know that smoking can cause inflammation. And so it's largely probably inflaming the environment and leading to more inflammation. And we know, as I showed in some of those slides, that inflammation is a driver of a lot of the disease progression. In terms of breaking that down, I don't know if that's part of the question in terms of whether, if we replaced smoking with nicotine patches or things like that, probably there would be benefits, but I can't say that I've necessarily seen any data published on that. But the data is really strong in terms of, one, its impact on susceptibility. We know that people who smoke are at an increased risk of developing MS. The more people smoke, the greater that increase in risk. But also now there is really, really strong evidence to show that it also worsens disease progression, as I said, probably through causing inflammation. But also, it doesn't matter at what point you quit. So sometimes I know there is a bit of a mindset of, well, I'm already at this point, quitting now is not going to help. They've really conclusively shown that quitting at any point, if you think about this as a curve of disease progression, and this is continuing to smoke versus quitting, any point along that line, if you quit, it changes the slope of that line. So it's, a really, really strong public health message around this for people living with MS, that in terms of things you can do to help, manage your MS, if you are a smoker, quitting smoking is one of the best things that you could do.
Absolutely. And that's another question about lifestyle changes. And that's about your opinion on the strong dairy and meat-free diet.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'll bring this back to what the consensus is at the conference, that there's no evidence really to suggest when we talk about for people living with MS in general. We obviously have SWANK, we have OMS, we have WILES, we've got Mediterranean. There's lots of different diets that get talked about. There's no strong evidence to suggest that any one diet is better than any other for people living with MS. In terms of me giving my opinion around this and some of those MS specific diets being promoted as MS specific diets, some of them can be quite restrictive in terms of things that are being cut out or eliminated. All I would say around this, and this is purely opinion, and I'm not a dietitian, but all I would say when people talk to me about this is think about how you do this scientifically. So, the biggest thing I think we should all be doing, and this is people living with MS, this is the general population, is adopting a healthy diet. Now, if as part of that, as a person living with MS, you've seen some things that suggest, eliminating dairy might be beneficial or something like that. All I would say is that what you need to do around that is think about, if you were doing this as a research study, how would you approach that? And so there's a couple of key things that I would do. One, before I made any changes, I would, start to take a record of how I'm feeling. And I would do that across a period of time. So, maybe a month of each day, taking note of, some of your key symptoms. So how fatigued are you? How are you feeling cognitively? All of those things, just taking a little journal and writing that down. And that's, essentially what we call forming your baseline, getting an idea of how you are before you make any changes. And then if you want to try adjusting part of your diet, make a change, but just make one change. If you make 100 changes and you see differences, you're not going to know what in of those changes is actually beneficial. So I would make a change, and then you have to give it a period of time to work as well. So if it's cutting out dairy, cut out dairy, and then you give it a period of time to see if there's any changes, because it's not going to happen straight away. But keep that daily monitoring of what's going on in the same way. And then after a period of time, have a look. And, because at an individual level, this is different to what we're talking about at a big picture level, where we're saying there's not necessarily one best diet. For a person, there may be a best diet that suits you. So you can look at making those changes, taking in bits and pieces from different MS diets that are talked about, but do one at a time. Do it in consultation with your healthcare professionals, because, when we're talking about people living with MS, we know that energy production and fatigue are big things. So you've got to be careful about changes to diet and things like that. But just try to approach it in that way. But yeah, I think the main message in terms of, all of these different diets is there's nothing across people living with MS that suggests one is better than the other at this point.
Oh, thank you so much for your advice. And the next question is about BTKs. Mm-hmm. Are any in the pipeline with trials that have gotten through 3 rounds?
So there's some phase. So BTKs are bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitors. Get that out. So these are a new class of therapies that have shown some potential. There's 4 different ones that are in the pipeline that I know of, and I'm not going to try and name all of them. Evobrutinib is one, tolobrutinib is another. But so they basically work on a different sort of mechanism to existing treatments, but there are a few different ones that are slightly different in terms of how they go about it. But they're inhibiting enzymes. Yes, there are some in phase 3. Now, one of them had their phase 3 trial halted because there were some side effects that were concerning, and so that got stopped. Now, I don't know if that then led to the others being stopped. I didn't hear much about it at the conference, any updates. We haven't got any of those phase 3 results, but yeah, BTKIs are certainly something that there is interest in. There's something that's been talked about, but it wasn't in any of the sessions I was in terms of updates on that. And I haven't seen anything much online in terms of new data published on those trials, but it is ongoing and certainly something that people are interested in because new treatment options As we know, we have lots of new treatment. We have lots of treatment options at the moment, but not everyone works for every person, and they work to different extents. So the more treatments that we can get, the better it is for people living with MS.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Another question is if you can talk more about papers that presenting and address impact of lifestyle modification.
Yeah, I mean, there is stuff that's published on it. That's probably, it's a big topic to just talk about. I mean, I think the main takeaways on it are exercise is beneficial, diet is beneficial. I don't think there's any questioning around that. The data that's been published on that is pretty conclusive to show that you know, they're both beneficial, and again, the earlier people get on them, the better the long-term outcomes. You know, in terms of publications, there's been some diet studies that have shown. There was a recent Mediterranean diet study that showed maybe it has beneficial impacts on cognition. There's certainly been exercise studies and differing exercise studies. So some using resistance training, others using more hydrotherapy, water aerobics, that have shown they can provide benefits in terms of reduced fatigue, improved mobility. So there's lots around those sorts of things. I don't know if you meant lifestyle modifications outside of diet and exercise. Smoking is the other big one, obviously, that I've already talked about. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to, without going into every specific paper, and there's probably too many to do that. You know, there's a lot out there looking at those different diets and the benefits. But yeah, I think the big takeaway messages are just they are beneficial, and finding the right diet for you and the right exercise for you is going to be important and will likely have benefits.
Yep, thank you so much. So a completely different question. It's about the EDSS scale. If there's any other scales assessing EDSS beyond just the physical and bladder bowels ones.
So there are other scales other than EDSS that are used. So there's the MSSS, the Multiple Sclerosis Severity Score, is a different one. Now, I'm off the top of my head, can't give a lot of specifics into the exact differences of the scores. I'm not a trialist, so I don't know necessarily all of the specifics of all of the different ones. There was, what I can say about this is that there was conversations and sessions I was in at the conference discussing EDSS and discussing whether or not it's necessarily the best marker. Certainly some things have been shown where benefits have been observed, not necessarily just using the EDSS scale. But yes, there are lots of different ones outside physical and bladder, did you say? I mean, yeah, there's lots of different markers depending on what's being looked at. EDSS is obviously a very common one, but I think more and more we're thinking about what are the best outcomes to use in trials, and there is certainly conversations around whether EDSS is going to be the best one for that. You know, certainly in terms of remyelination therapies, I don't think it necessarily is going to be the best one for that. So yeah, I don't know if that particularly answers the question very well, but yes, there are definitely other scales and definitely lots of other measures that are used across studies, depending on the study and what they're trying to look into.
Thank you for that. I'm really aware of the time, and it's 8 o'clock, and we're going to take one more question. And because we're getting into summer now, as the question is, why does heat have such a profound effect on MS and affects mobility?
Really good question. So there's a thing called the Uthoff phenomenon, UHTHOFF, which I believe is what it's called, and this seems to be linked to it in terms of the mechanisms of what that is. I can't give you a great answer on it, but there's some really interesting stuff on it, and linking back to lifestyle modifications and exercise. One of the biggest barriers to people living with MS doing exercise is the fact that when they do exercise, obviously the body temperature rises, and so they can often find that, or one of the reasons why people might shy away from doing exercise is that they find afterwards they actually feel much worse, and that's because of the overheating that they've had and the lack of temperature control, or the greater difficulty with temperature control during the exercise. And there's been some research really interesting in its simplicity almost of research coming out of Sydney that's looked at people living with MS doing exercise, and actually the huge benefits that can be gained during exercise of drinking ice cold water, both before, during, and after the exercise, as opposed to just drinking sort of tap water. So yeah, it's a very well-known phenomenon. I don't know that we have a great idea. I know that it's linked to Uthoff phenomenon, and there's going to be things to do with nervous system regulation and control of all of these mechanisms. But yeah, I don't know that beyond that, we have a great idea of exactly what's going on at the heat to do that. But yes, it's very interesting, and certainly something that we need to be mindful of going into summer, when we know that temperatures can get really hot.